Hello, dear listeners. I'm Mooncat, and tonight we journey through an enchanting retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, where the whispers of the forest and the glow of a crimson cloak will lull you into serene slumber. Now, let's step softly into the woods together on the edge of a sleepy village where golden wildflowers danced in the breeze and the sky seemed to hum with a soft, eternal melody. There stood a little stone cottage. Its thatched roof, mossy and warm with the morning sun, cradled the secrets of many quiet years. Inside, where the air carried the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread and lavender sprigs tucked beneath windowsills, lived a girl with hair as dark as midnight and eyes alight with wonder. Her name was Little Red Riding Hood, though her mother simply called her Red. She was not yet old enough to lose herself in grown-up cares, but was just old enough to wonder what lay beyond the green hills and winding forest paths. This morning, as the sun peeked over the horizon, Red stood before a wooden table, her nimble fingers tying a checkered cloth over a small basket. Inside were treasures of comfort, a loaf of warm, crusty bread, a jar of wildflower honey that gleamed like captured sunlight, and a pot of her mother's famous blackberry preserves. Each item was chosen with care, bound for her dear grandmother, who lived deep in the heart of the woods. "Remember, my darling," her mother said softly as she draped the crimson cloak over Red's shoulders. The fabric, so vibrant it seemed to glow even in the dim light of the cottage, fit snugly, its silken folds brushing against her arms. "This cloak is special, a gift from your grandmother. It will keep you warm, safe, and seen wherever you go. But always stay on the path and trust your heart." Red gazed at her mother, who smiled, though her eyes held a flicker of worry that only mothers carry. Red nodded, her heart alight with the thrill of a new adventure. She didn't understand yet what it meant to trust her heart, but she held the advice close as she kissed her mother's cheek and stepped into the bright morning. The air outside was cool and sweet, the scent of dew-kissed grass mingling with the distant perfume of blooming flowers. Red's cloak billowed gently as she skipped along the path, the rhythmic sound of her boots tapping softly against the earth. Each step felt like a lullaby to the waking forest. The basket swung in her hand, and she couldn't help but hum a tune her grandmother had taught her long ago. The melody matched the rhythm of her steps, weaving itself into the sounds around her, the chirp of crickets bidding farewell to the night, the distant trill of songbirds welcoming the day. Red paused at the edge of the woods, where the sunlight filtered through the trees in golden beams, scattering patterns on the ground like a painter's brush had swept the earth. She breathed in deeply, filling her lungs with the earthy, mossy air. The forest seemed alive, watching her with a quiet, benevolent curiosity. As she stepped beneath the canopy, the world around her changed. The open sky gave way to a ceiling of green and gold, the rustling leaves whispering secrets to one another. The path stretched before her, winding gently like a thread of light between the trees. With each step, Red's thoughts wandered. She marveled at how the world seemed to shift when one entered the woods, how time softened, and the boundaries between reality and dream blurred. It was as though the forest itself was a story waiting to be told, each tree and flower a character with a tale of its own. She touched the edge of her cloak, feeling its smooth fabric beneath her fingers. Safe and seen, she murmured to herself, the words her mother had said echoing like a song in her mind. Did the cloak truly have a kind of magic? She wasn't sure, but as it caught the light filtering through the leaves, it seemed to shimmer as though it held a piece of the sunrise. Red's heart swelled with wonder. The woods stretched on before her, inviting and mysterious. She thought of her grandmother's cottage, nestled somewhere deep within this enchanted world, a place filled with warmth and stories of its own. And though she couldn't see it yet, she could feel its presence ahead, calling her forward as the trees whispered above and the forest wrapped her in its gentle embrace. Red felt a quiet sense of courage bloom within her, a courage born not from fearlessness, but from the belief that kindness and curiosity would guide her. And so, with her crimson cloak flowing behind her like a banner of light, Little Red Riding Hood began her journey. Each step a promise of discovery, her heart open to the magic that awaited. The forest welcomed Little Red Riding Hood with a hushed symphony. The rustling leaves overhead sounded like the soft turning of ancient pages, and the whispering wind carried secrets only the woods knew. The air was cool and fresh, tinged with the earthy aroma of moss and the sweetness of blooming wildflowers. Red felt as though she had stepped into a living, breathing dream. She paused for a moment, letting her eyes trace the patterns of sunlight that danced on the forest floor. The trees here were tall and wise, their branches reaching out as if to embrace the sky. Each leaf quivered with a life of its own, trembling in time with the soft pulse of the world around her. Red tilted her head back, her crimson hood slipping slightly, and she closed her eyes. She breathed deeply, savoring the gentle hum of the forest. She felt small here, but not in an unsettling way. It was as though she were a single note in a beautiful song, essential, yet just one part of something vast and harmonious. As her boots carried her forward, the sound of her steps mingled with the soft crackle of twigs and the occasional flutter of wings. A sparrow darted across her path, its feathers catching the sunlight like drops of melted gold. Red stopped to watch, a smile playing on her lips. "Good morning," she whispered, though the sparrow was already gone, vanishing into the tapestry of leaves above. The path ahead curved gently, leading her deeper into the woods. Here, the trees seemed closer, their trunks wrapped in curling ivy, patches of wildflowers, bluebells, buttercups, and violets bloomed in little bursts of color like scattered jewels. She crouched to pick a violet, its petals soft as silk against her fingertips, and tucked it into the folds of her cloak. The forest seemed to respond to her presence. The wind grew softer, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and damp earth. The sounds of the village, its distant chimneys and chattering voices, were long gone now. All that remained was the forest, its quiet, unhurried rhythm, drawing her further into its embrace. As Red walked, her thoughts drifted like the clouds above the treetops. She thought of her grandmother, whose cottage was a sanctuary of warmth and wisdom. She imagined the stories her grandmother might tell, her voice soft and lilting as she spoke of the stars, the seasons, and the creatures of the forest. Red longed to sit by the hearth, the basket of treats between them, as they shared laughter and tales. A reverie was broken by a sound, soft and low, like the brush of fur against bark. Red turned her head, her heart skipping just slightly. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping onto the path with a slow, deliberate grace. It was a wolf. Its coat was silver, glinting faintly in the dappled sunlight, and its eyes, a golden amber, seemed to hold the light of the forest itself. The wolf paused a few paces ahead, tilting its head as though studying her. Red held her breath, not out of fear, but from the sheer wonder of seeing such a creature so close. "Good morning," the wolf said, its voice smooth and rich, like the flow of a deep river. Red blinked, momentarily taken aback. She had never heard a wolf speak before, but here in the woods it felt oddly natural, as if the forest had given him the gift of words. "Good morning," Red replied, her voice soft but steady. "And where might you be headed on such a fine day?" the wolf asked, his gaze flicking to the basket she carried. Red hesitated, remembering her mother's advice to stay on the path and keep her wits about her. But there was something about the wolf's tone, curious and calm, that made her feel at ease. "I'm going to my grandmother's cottage," she said. "She lives on the other side of the forest." The wolf's ears perked up and he nodded slowly. "A noble journey," he said. "And such a thoughtful basket of treasures you carry. Your grandmother must be very lucky to have you." Red smiled at the compliment, but kept her distance. "She's kind to me too," she said simply. The wolf stepped aside, his movements fluid, almost cat-like. "Well then, little traveller," he said with a bow of his head, "safe journey to you. The woods are vast, but the path will always guide you." With that, the wolf turned and disappeared into the shadows as quietly as he had appeared. Red stood still for a moment, her heart fluttering like a bird's wings. There was something peculiar about the wolf, something both enchanting and unsettling. But the forest, ever gentle, seemed to urge her forward. The sunlight, which had dimmed slightly during the encounter, now brightened again, spilling in golden ribbons through the trees. Red adjusted her hood, the crimson fabric catching the light, and continued on her way. The forest felt different now. Its whispers seemed more distinct, its shadows a touch deeper. Yet she felt no fear. If anything, her curiosity had grown. Each step brought her closer to her grandmother's cottage, but Red sensed that the journey itself held lessons yet to unfold. She glanced at her cloak, its soft folds swaying with her movements, and smiled. It wasn't the forest's magic she trusted most. It was her own heart, and as long as it led her, she would not stray. The woods whispered their approval as she walked, carrying her ever deeper into their timeless embrace. The path beneath Little Red Riding Hood's feet grew softer, cushioned by moss and scattered petals that shimmered like dewdrops in the gentle light. The forest seemed to breathe with her, its rhythm slow and steady, like the rise and fall of a lullaby. Each step carried her deeper into its heart, where the air grew sweeter and the silence more profound, broken only by the occasional trill of a bird or the rustle of unseen creatures. Red held her basket with care, her fingers brushing the smooth weave of its handle. She thought of her grandmother again, of the warmth that always radiated from her, a glow that wasn't from the hearth, but from the kindness in her heart. Red smiled softly, picturing the joy on her grandmother's face when she saw the gifts inside the basket. The thought gave her feet purpose, though the path ahead now seemed to offer more questions than answers. The trail forked suddenly, splitting into 3 distinct paths. Red stopped, her breath catching, as she looked from one to the next. Each trail seemed to call to her in its own way, whispering promises she couldn't quite decipher. The first path was lined with glowing bluebells that swayed gently as though bowing to her presence. Their faint luminescence cast a silvery light on the trail, and the air seemed to hum with an otherworldly melody. Red tilted her head, enchanted by the beauty of it. It felt magical, yet there was something about its perfection that gave her pause. The second path disappeared into a soft veil of mist, the kind that seemed to cradle the trees and blur the edges of reality. The mist swirled like a dancer, inviting her forward with its mystery, but beneath its allure, Red felt a faint tug of uncertainty. The unknown stretched ahead like an unsung song, waiting for someone to give it a voice. The third path was quiet and familiar, the earth firm beneath her boots and the trees steady and watchful. It was simple, unadorned, but comforting in its honesty, the kind of path that held no surprises, only the promise of safe passage. Red stood at the crossroads, her heart fluttering with indecision. Her mother's words echoed softly in her mind. Stay on the path and trust your heart. But which path was the path? She touched the edge of her crimson cloak, its soft folds grounding her as she took a deep breath. Trust my heart, she murmured, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. She closed her eyes, letting the forest speak to her, not with words, but with the gentle currents of air and the subtle shifts in sound. When she opened her eyes, the bluebells caught her gaze again, their light dancing like tiny stars fallen to earth. Perhaps I'll just take a closer look, she said to herself, stepping off the main trail and onto the first path. The flower's glow seemed to brighten as she moved forward, and Red couldn't help but reach down to pick one. Its petals were impossibly soft, its fragrance delicate and sweet. She held it to her nose, closing her eyes, as the scent wrapped around her like a memory she couldn't quite place. But as she stood there, the forest around her grew quieter, almost too quiet. She opened her eyes to find that the path ahead had become shrouded in shadows. The bluebells no longer glowed as brightly, and the air felt heavy. Red took a step back, her instincts stirring. She placed the flower gently in her basket and turned, retracing her steps to the crossroads. The misty path now seemed to beckon her more strongly, its swirling veil parting slightly, as if inviting her in. Red hesitated, her heart tugged by its beauty and mystery. But a faint breeze brushed her cheek, carrying with it the scent of the main trail, the scent of pine and wildflowers, of home and hearth. A soft smile graced her lips. She knew where she belonged. "Thank you," she whispered to the forest, though she wasn't sure who or what she was thanking. Red returned to the simple path, the one that had carried her safely this far. The woods seemed to hum in approval, their whispers growing softer like a sigh of relief. She walked on, her steps light and steady, the flower she had picked nestled in her basket as a token of the choice she had made. As the sunlight broke through the trees, dappling her cloak with golden light, Red reflected on the moment. Life, she realized, was full of choices, each one a thread in a larger tapestry. Some choices dazzled, others mystified, but it was the quiet ones, the paths of honesty and instinct, that often led to the truest destinations. The trail ahead curved gently, its bends hidden by the embracing arms of the forest. Red did not know what awaited her, but she felt no fear. She carried her heart like a compass, steady and unwavering, its quiet song guiding her forward. And so, with the forest as her companion, and her cloak catching the light like a beacon, Little Red Riding Hood continued her journey, a spirit as bright as the crimson fabric that flowed behind her. The forest began to thin as Little Red Riding Hood approached the edge of its embrace. Sunlight broke through the trees in radiant shafts, spilling golden light onto the winding path. The air felt different here, lighter, warmer, and fragrant with the mingling scents of herbs and blossoms. Red's heart swelled with quiet excitement as she rounded a bend and caught sight of her grandmother's cottage nestled among the trees. It was a quaint little home, its stone walls covered in ivy that shimmered like emerald threads. The roof, steep and mossy, seemed to sag ever so slightly in the middle, giving the house the appearance of a kind old face. The garden surrounding it was alive with colour. Rows of marigolds, lavender, and chamomile swayed gently in the breeze, while climbing roses framed the windows. Red paused, taking in the familiar sight. This was not just a house. It was a place of stories, laughter, and love. Each stone and flower seemed to hold a memory, and the sight of it filled her with the kind of peace that only comes from returning to a cherished place. Yet, something felt different this time. The garden was too still, the air carrying a faint tension she couldn't quite place. Red tilted her head, her crimson hood slipping slightly as she tried to listen beyond the gentle rustling of the leaves. She stepped forward, her boots crunching softly against the gravel path that led to the cottage door. The sound was oddly loud in the quiet, and her heart began to beat a little faster. She knocked once, twice, her knuckles brushing against the smooth wood of the door. "Grandmother," she called softly, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty. From inside came a faint rustle, like the shift of fabric or the creak of an old chair. "Come in, my dear," a voice replied, muffled and hoarse. Red frowned slightly. Her grandmother's voice, usually warm and lilting, sounded strained, as though she were fighting a cold. Pushing the door open gently, Red stepped inside. The cottage greeted her with its familiar scent of dried herbs, beeswax candles, and the faint trace of wood smoke. The interior was dim, the windows half covered by lace curtains, allowing only slivers of sunlight to fall across the floor. Her grandmother lay in bed, propped up against a pile of soft patchwork pillows. She wore her usual shawl, its faded pattern a quilt of memories, and her spectacles perched crookedly on the bridge of her nose. Her face was partly hidden by the shadows, and her hands, folded atop the quilt, seemed unusually still. Red approached slowly, her basket in hand. "I've brought you bread and honey," she said softly, setting the basket on a small table by the bed. Her grandmother's eyes flicked toward it, and for a moment Red thought she saw a gleam of something unfamiliar in them, something sharp, like a flash of sunlight on a blade. "Thank you, my dear," her grandmother said, her voice raspy and low. "How thoughtful you are." Red smiled, but her unease grew. The air in the room felt heavy, and a faint chill crept along her skin. She moved closer, her gaze narrowing slightly as she studied her grandmother. "Grandmother," she began hesitantly, "what big eyes you have today." Her grandmother blinked, her expression unreadable. "The better to see you with, my child," she replied, her voice carrying a strange cadence, as though she were speaking a line from a play she barely remembered. "And what big ears you have," Red continued, her own voice soft but steady. "The better to hear you with," came the reply, the words quick and clipped. Red's heart began to race, but she kept her composure. Her eyes fell to the quilt where her grandmother's hands rested, their shape now seeming unfamiliar. Larger, darker, with faint traces of fur along the knuckles. "Into big hands you have," Red whispered, her voice barely audible. Her grandmother, or what she thought was her grandmother, paused, and for the briefest moment the room was utterly silent. Then the figure in the bed shifted, a low chuckle breaking the stillness. "The better to hold you with, my dear," the voice purred, and in that instant the shadows seemed to ripple and shift. Wren took a step back, her heart pounding, but before she could speak, the door to the cottage creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. "Enough games, you sly creature," a warm, familiar voice called. Red turned to see her real grandmother standing in the doorway, a basket of herbs in one hand and a sturdy walking stick in the other. Her eyes, sharp and kind, sparkled with quiet amusement. The figure in the bed let out a sigh, its form unraveling like mist. The wolf emerged, his silver coat gleaming faintly in the dim light. He stretched lazily, as though he had simply been biding his time. "You knew I was here all along," he said, his voice carrying a note of reluctant admiration. "Of course I did," her grandmother replied, stepping further into the room. "You think I don't know every sound and shadow in my own cottage?" The wolf chuckled, shaking his head. "You are cleverer than most, old woman." Red stood frozen, her mind racing to catch up with what had just happened, but her grandmother's warm hand on her shoulder brought her back to the moment. "Don't fret, my dear," her grandmother said gently. "Our visitor here has a habit of testing boundaries, but he means no harm." The wolf inclined his head, his amber eyes gleaming with something that looked almost like respect. "A lesson in caution, perhaps," he said smoothly. Red's heart began to slow as her grandmother guided her to the table where the basket of treats sat untouched. "Come now," she said with a smile. "Let's have some tea. There's much to talk about, and not all secrets are meant to frighten." And so, as the wolf settled by the hearth, and the fire began to crackle softly, Red found herself caught between wonder and relief. The forest, she realized, held more mysteries than she had ever imagined. But in the warmth of her grandmother's cottage, she felt safe, curious, and ready to learn. The golden light of late afternoon painted the world in soft, honeyed hues as Little Red Riding Hood stood just beyond her grandmother's cottage door. The air carried the faint scent of chamomile and lavender, mingling with the lingering warmth of baked bread and smouldering firewood. Inside, the world was hushed, as though the cottage itself were holding its breath. The wolf, now seated near the hearth, stretched lazily on the braided rug, his silver coat shimmering like moonlight on water. The soft crackle of the fire and the rhythmic ticking of a wooden clock were the only sounds, filling the room with a comforting cadence. Red, perched on a cushioned chair near the small table where her basket sat, untouched, her hands resting lightly in her lap. Her grandmother, ever composed, moved gracefully about the room. She brewed a pot of tea with practiced ease, her movements a soothing rhythm of clinking porcelain and the faint rustle of dried herbs. Red watched her carefully, her gaze drifting now and then to the wolf, who appeared entirely at ease, his sharp amber eyes half-lidded. "I hope the tea will steady your nerves, my dear," her grandmother said, as she brought the steaming pot to the table. She set it down with a soft clink, followed by delicate teacups that gleamed faintly in the firelight. "It's a special blend, meant to calm the heart and clear the mind." Red smiled faintly, her fingers brushing the smooth rim of the teacup as her grandmother poured. The fragrant steam rose in delicate spirals, carrying the scent of lemon balm, rose petals, and honey. She took a sip, the warmth spreading through her like a gentle embrace, softening the tension that lingered in her chest. The wolf shifted slightly, his ears twitching as he glanced at Red. "You look as though you have 100 questions, little one," he said, in a voice as smooth as the tea she drank. Red hesitated, her fingers tightening around the teacup. She looked to her grandmother, whose steady gaze met hers with quiet reassurance. "Go on, child," her grandmother encouraged. "There's no harm in asking." Drawing a deep breath, Red turned to the wolf. "Why did you pretend to be my grandmother?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. The wolf's eyes sparkled with faint amusement as he rested his chin on his paws. "Ah," he began, his tone carrying the weight of a story untold. "The forest is a place of balance, you see. It tests those who walk its paths, revealing their hearts, whether they be brave, kind, or wary. I was curious about you, little traveler. I wanted to see if you were as clever and steadfast as the tales about you say. Red tilted her head, her brow furrowing slightly. Tales about me? Her grandmother chuckled softly, setting her own cup down. You've grown up near these woods, my dear. The forest knows you. It watches, listens, and remembers. Those who walk its paths often leave their mark. Red thought back to the trails she had walked that day, the glowing bluebells, the swirling mists, the quiet whispers of the trees. She remembered the choices she had made, each step guided by her heart. A faint warmth spread through her chest at the thought that the forest had been watching, not as a predator, but as a guardian. You're braver than most, the wolf said, interrupting her thoughts. Many would have fled at the first sight of a wolf, or perhaps at the first fork in the road, but you held your ground. That's why I stayed my claws. A heart like yours is worth understanding. His words settled over Red like a soft cloak, their weight both humbling and empowering. She looked to her grandmother, who smiled gently, her expression a blend of pride and wisdom. The wolf may test the spirit, her grandmother said, but it is the heart that answers. And yours, my dear, has answered with courage and kindness. The fire crackled softly, its golden light flickering across the walls. Red sipped her tea, her thoughts swirling like the patterns of the lace curtains swaying gently in the breeze. The day had been full of mysteries. Some answered, others still lingering, like the shadows at the edge of the forest. Her grandmother reached for the basket Red had brought, lifting its checkered cloth to reveal the treasures inside. She smiled as she unpacked the loaf of bread, the jar of honey, and the pot of blackberry preserves. You've brought such wonderful things, she said warmly, a feast to share. Ah, the wolf raised his head, his ears perking up. Sharing with a wolf, are we? He teased, his sharp teeth glinting as he grinned. Only if the wolf behaves, her grandmother replied with a playful wink, her words light and teasing, but firm. Red giggled softly, the tension in the room finally dissipating entirely. The three of them, girl, grandmother, and wolf, gathered around the small table, sharing the bread and honey, their laughter mingling with the crackle of the fire. As the evening deepened, Red felt her heart grow light. The cottage, once filled with quiet tension, now glowed with warmth and harmony. She realized that even in the face of uncertainty, trust and understanding could create a space of peace. When the last crumbs had been eaten and the fire began to die down, Red felt her eyes grow heavy. Her grandmother noticed and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. It's time to rest, my dear, she said softly. Red nodded, her thoughts still swirling like a quiet stream. The wolf stretched once more before retreating to a corner of the room, curling up with a contented sigh. Her grandmother tucked her into a small cot near the hearth, the quilt smelling faintly of lavender and sun. As Red's eyes closed, she felt the forest's presence still lingering around her, its whispers now soft and reassuring. In her dreams, she walked the paths again, her crimson cloak trailing behind her like a thread, weaving her into the tapestry of the woods. And in the quiet glow of the cottage, beneath the watchful eyes of the moon and stars, the world seemed perfectly at peace. The soft glow of morning bathed the little cottage in hues of amber and gold. Little Red Riding Hood stirred beneath the quilt, the gentle hum of the waking forest lulling her from sleep. The faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, mingling with the earthy aroma of tea brewing on the hearth. Outside, the garden rustled with the early morning breeze, as if the flowers themselves were stretching toward the light. Red blinked awake, her eyes adjusting to the soft light that spilled across the wooden floor. She saw her grandmother at the table, her movements calm and deliberate as she worked with her collection of herbs and spices. The wolf, still curled up near the hearth, flicked his tail lazily as he dozed, his silver fur catching the golden light like a mirror of the dawn. "Good morning, my dear," her grandmother said softly, glancing over her shoulder with a warm smile. "Did you sleep well?" Red nodded, sitting up and smoothing the folds of her crimson cloak. "I did, grandmother. It felt like the forest was singing me a lullaby all night." Her grandmother chuckled gently, her hands carefully bundling sprigs of rosemary and thyme. "The forest knows how to care for its own," she said. "But the day ahead holds its own challenges, and we must prepare." Red tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "Prepare? For what?" Her grandmother's eyes twinkled with a knowing light. "For teaching our silver-furred friend a lesson in humility," she said, her voice soft but firm. The wolf's ears twitched, and he opened one eye, his golden gaze meeting the grandmother's with a mix of amusement and caution. "A lesson, you say?" he asked, his voice smooth as river stones. The grandmother turned fully, holding up the bundle of herbs. "Indeed," she replied. "You've tested my granddaughter's courage, but now it's time you learn the value of respect, and perhaps a touch of gratitude." Red looked from her grandmother to the wolf, her curiosity deepening. "What are you planning, grandmother?" she asked. Her grandmother smiled, her expression gentle but resolute. "A little magic, my dear. Not the kind you'll find in stories of spells and potions, but the quiet magic of understanding and balance." The wolf stretched languidly, his sharp teeth glinting as he yawned. "And what form will this lesson take, wise one?" he asked, his voice laced with intrigue. The grandmother gestured to the table, where a simple earthen teapot sat surrounded by small jars of honey, herbs, and spices. "We'll share a cup of tea," she said, "but this will not be an ordinary brew." Red watched as her grandmother carefully added the herbs to the pot, each movement deliberate and rhythmic, as though she were weaving a spell with her hands. Rosemary for clarity, chamomile for calm, thyme for strength, and a pinch of cinnamon for warmth. She finished with a drizzle of golden honey, stirring slowly as the steam rose in fragrant spirals. "This tea," her grandmother said, "will show us the truth of the heart. It will soften the edges of pride and sharpen the vision of kindness, and it will remind even the most cunning of wolves that strength is not measured by might alone." The wolf chuckled, his amber eyes narrowing slightly. "A clever plan indeed," he said, his tone both playful and wary. "But I've never turned down a challenge or a cup of tea." The grandmother poured the tea into 3 delicate cups, its golden hue shimmering in the morning light. She handed one to the wolf, one to Red, and kept the last for herself. Red held her cup carefully, the warmth seeping into her hands as she breathed in the tea's soothing aroma. She sipped slowly, the flavors unfolding on her tongue like a story told in whispers. It was sweet and grounding, with a faint, lingering spice that seemed to awaken something deep within her. The wolf drank too, his movements slow and deliberate. As the tea warmed his chest, his sharp features softened, and the ever-present gleam of mischief in his eyes dimmed slightly. He set the cup down, his tail flicking thoughtfully. "This is no ordinary tea," he murmured, his voice quieter now. The grandmother smiled knowingly. No, it is not. It has reminded you of something, hasn't it?" The wolf hesitated, his gaze flickering between the grandmother and Red. "Perhaps," he said finally, his tone less guarded. "It reminds me of the forest, the way it cradles its own and demands respect, even from those of us who think ourselves above its laws." Red watched him carefully, her own thoughts swirling like the tea in her cup. She realized that the wolf, for all his cunning and sharpness, was not so different from the forest itself, wild and unpredictable, but also capable of balance and beauty. Her grandmother reached across the table, resting her hand lightly on the wolf's paw. "You see now that strength is not in trickery or force," she said softly. "It is in understanding, in harmony, and in choosing to protect rather than to take." The wolf nodded slowly, his gaze lowering as if in quiet reflection. "Perhaps you are right, old woman," he said. "There is more to be gained from kindness than from fear." The morning light grew brighter, spilling through the windows and filling the room with a golden glow. The forest outside seemed to hum in approval, its leaves rustling softly in the breeze. Red looked at her grandmother, then at the wolf, a quiet sense of peace settling over her. She realized that the lesson her grandmother had taught was not just for the wolf. It was for all of them. The world, after all, was a web of choices, each thread connected to the next, and it was in choosing kindness and balance that the strongest threads were woven. As the last sip of tea was shared, the cottage seemed to exhale, its walls holding the warmth of the moment like a treasured memory. And in the stillness that followed, Red felt the quiet magic of the forest wrap around her like a cloak, its song echoing softly in her heart. The morning sun filtered gently through the canopy of trees, casting golden patterns that danced across the forest floor. The air was warm and sweet, carrying the faint scent of pine and wildflowers. It was as if the woods themselves had woken with a newfound sense of peace, their whispers softer, their shadows lighter. Little Red Riding Hood, her crimson cloak flowing like a banner of light, stepped outside her grandmother's cottage. The wolf followed close behind, his silver fur gleaming in the sunlight, his golden eyes softer now, no longer sharp with mischief. Her grandmother lingered at the door, a quiet smile on her face as she watched the pair set off into the heart of the forest. The path ahead was familiar, yet it felt changed somehow. The trees stood taller, their branches stretching toward the sky, as though reaching for something greater. The songs of birds filled the air, a melody woven with the rustle of leaves and the distant trickle of a stream. As they walked, Red turned to the wolf. "Do you think the forest knows?" she asked, her voice soft, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the harmony around them. The wolf tilted his head, his ears twitching thoughtfully. "The forest always knows," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the ancient woods. "It watches and listens, and when its balance is restored, it breathes a little easier." Red nodded, her gaze drifting to the path ahead. She thought of her journey, the choices she had made, the lessons she had learned. The forest, once a place of mystery and uncertainty, now felt like an old friend, its presence wrapping around her like the folds of her crimson cloak. The wolf's ears perked up, and he paused, his nose lifting to the breeze. "We have visitors," he said, his voice tinged with amusement. Red followed his gaze and saw the forest coming to life. A family of deer stepped softly from the trees, their wide eyes filled with curiosity. Birds flitted down to perch on low branches, their feathers catching the sunlight like tiny jewels. Rabbits peeked out from beneath bushes, their noses twitching as they sniffed the air. It was as if the forest had gathered to witness the change, to see the unity that now bloomed. like wildflowers after a gentle rain. The wolf stepped forward, his movements fluid and deliberate, as though understanding the importance of this moment. He lowered his head slightly, a gesture of respect, and the deer stepped closer, their delicate hooves barely making a sound. Red watched in quiet awe, her heart swelling with the beauty of it all. The forest, once a place of tests and trials, now felt whole, its creatures no longer wary but curious, as though drawn to the harmony that had been restored. "You see, little one," the wolf said softly, his amber eyes meeting hers, "even the wildest hearts can find peace when they choose to listen and understand." Red smiled, the warmth of his words settling over her like a soft breeze. She thought of the lessons her grandmother had shared, of the tea that had softened edges and revealed truths, and of the choices she had made to trust her heart. As the forest grew brighter, Red felt a quiet determination bloom within her. "The forest has given so much," she said, her voice steady. "It feels right to give something back." The wolf regarded her for a moment, then nodded. "And what would you give?" he asked. Red reached into her basket and drew out the violet she had picked on her journey. Its petals, though small and delicate, glowed faintly in the sunlight, as if still holding the magic of the forest. She knelt and gently placed it on the mossy ground, her fingers brushing the earth. "This," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "a piece of my journey, a part of my heart." The wolf watched silently, his expression unreadable, but the golden light in his eyes seemed to soften even further. Around them the forest grew still, as if holding its breath. Then, as if in answer, the trees swayed gently, their leaves whispering in unison. Red stood, brushing her hands against her cloak. "It's not much," she said softly, "but it feels right." The wolf smiled, a rare and genuine expression that transformed his sharp features. "Sometimes the smallest gifts carry the greatest weight," he said. They continued their walk, the forest parting before them like a curtain of green and gold. The creatures that had gathered now followed at a respectful distance, their presence a quiet reminder of the unity that had been restored. As the sun climbed higher, Red felt a sense of fulfillment she couldn't quite put into words. The forest, the wolf, her grandmother, each had played a part in her journey, teaching her lessons she hadn't known she needed. And though the path ahead was still unwritten, she knew she carried with her the strength of the forest, the wisdom of her grandmother, and the bond she had forged with the wolf. Together, they walked into the heart of the woods, where sunlight and shadow danced in perfect harmony, and the whispers of the forest sang a song of unity, balance, and peace. The day's golden light softened, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows that danced across the forest floor. Little Red Riding Hood walked steadily along the familiar path, her crimson cloak trailing behind her like the last brushstroke of a vibrant painting. The air had cooled, tinged with the faint, earthy scent of the forest, settling into evening. The wolf walked beside her, his silver coat shimmering with the faint glow of twilight. His golden eyes seemed more serene now, no longer watchful or sharp, but calm like the steady flow of a quiet stream. The two moved in comfortable silence, their steps falling in rhythm with the forest's heartbeat. Red glanced at the wolf, a smile curling at the corners of her lips. "Will you stay in the forest?" she asked, her voice soft, as though speaking louder might disturb the harmony around them. The wolf paused, tilting his head thoughtfully. "The forest is where I belong," he said. "It has taught me, shaped me, and now I owe it my care." He turned his amber gaze to her. "And you, little one, will you remember the lessons it shared with you?" Red nodded, her heart light yet full with the weight of her journey. "I will," she said quietly. "The forest has given me so much, more than I ever expected." The wolf's tail flicked gently, a gesture of approval. "Then the forest will remember you too," he said. As they reached the edge of the woods, where the trees thinned and the rolling meadows began, the wolf stopped. He stood still, his ears twitching slightly as he listened to the distant hum of the village just beyond. "This is where I leave you," he said, his voice low but warm. "Your journey home is yours alone, though the forest will always be with you." Red turned to face him fully, her hands clasping the folds of her cloak. "Thank you," she said sincerely, her eyes meeting his. "For everything." The wolf bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect. "And thank you, little traveler," he replied, "for showing even a wolf the path to kindness." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows of the trees, his silver fur catching the last rays of sunlight before he vanished completely. Red stood there for a moment, her heart full of gratitude and wonder. The forest behind her whispered softly, as if bidding her farewell, its presence lingering like a warm embrace. She turned and began the final stretch of her journey home. The meadows glowed in the amber light of the setting sun, the tall grasses swaying gently in the breeze, the scent of the village, the faint smoke of hearth fires, and the sweetness of bread cooling on window sills drifted toward her, filling her with a comforting sense of belonging. As she reached the familiar stone cottage she called home, the door opened and her mother stepped out, her face lighting up at the sight of Red. "You're home," her mother said, her voice soft with relief and joy. Red smiled, her cheeks warm as she stepped into her mother's embrace. The touch was familiar, grounding her in the love and safety she had carried with her through the forest. Inside the cottage, the air was warm and fragrant, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Red set her basket down on the wooden table, its contents nearly forgotten amidst the treasure of stories she now carried in her heart. As she sat by the fire that evening, her mother by her side, Red found herself recounting her journey, the forest trails, the wolf, her grandmother's clever plan, and the peace they had found together. Her words flowed like the soft ripple of a stream, soothing and steady, filling the room with the quiet magic of her adventure. Her mother listened, her hands working gently on a piece of embroidery, though her gaze never left Red's face. When the story ended, she reached over and touched Red's hand. "The forest has shaped you," she said softly, "and I see its wisdom in you now." That night, as Red lay in her bed, the folds of her crimson cloak draped over a nearby chair, she gazed out the small window above her. The moon hung low in the sky, its silver light spilling across the meadows and casting a faint glow on the distant trees. She closed her eyes, her mind quiet but full. The lessons of the forest, the gentle strength of her grandmother, and the unexpected wisdom of the wolf, all of it lived within her now, woven into the fabric of who she was. The forest, she realized, was not just a place she had visited. It was a part of her, as much as the stars were a part of the night sky, and as sleep wrapped her in its tender embrace. The whispers of the woods echoed faintly in her dreams, singing a lullaby of balance, courage, and kindness. The world outside grew still, and the cottage nestled beneath the starlit sky seemed to exhale, its walls holding the warmth of a journey completed and the promise of new stories yet to come. And so, Little Red Riding Hood's journey comes to a peaceful close, her heart forever touched by the magic of the forest. Thank you for letting me guide you through this dreamy tale. If this story brought you calm and comfort, please like and subscribe. Until next time, rest well, dream deeply, and may the stars watch over you. Mooncat.